Relax and listen to the voice.
Welcome to Night of the CreepyPastas, Volume 1. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share with your friends. Alright, here we go. I live among parasites. I'm alone now. They're in the other room, eating the dog. They're eating the dog. They don't even try to hide it from me. I'm apparently so weak, I'm not a threat to them. They hid it when the cops came by. They broke out into smiles, acted personable and friendly, told them I was delusional, but not violent. They're mostly right. Every time I look at them, I want to kill them, but then I see my wife's face, my son's face, and I can't do it. Besides, they'd probably overpower me. I don't know where they came from. It started with the sore on my wife's back. At first, she thought it was from where her bra chafed, but after a few days, it began to swell and blister. I told her that it looked like a boil and that she should go get it lanced. She asked me to do it. By a professional, I said. I didn't want to touch it. She asked me to look at it again days later. It had gotten so big, the skin around it was red and angry, and the shiny bubble of the infected area was cloudy white. But when I looked closer, I saw movement in it. Something red seemed to swirl inside. That looks really bad, I told her. You really need to go see a doctor about it. She twisted her arms behind her. Maybe I can get it myself, she said. She tried to pop it like a zit, but I could see her tensing in pain every time she prodded at it. I couldn't watch. It was too gross. I started leaving when she gave a shriek. She had burst it. There was pus running down her back and on her fingers. There was a smell, too. Something rotten. I lost all desire to have anything to eat that day when the odor hit me. But the most noticeable thing was the long, segmented, wriggling worm thing that hung down from the open wound. What on earth is that? She didn't seem to feel it, but I could feel it on my own spine, the way that thing squirmed like it was pinned under a rock and trying to get free. Does it look better? She asked. Jesus Christ, woman! There's some sort of centipede or something hanging out. I should have known there was something wrong. The way she didn't immediately panic from being told that. Who in their right mind wouldn't panic if someone told them there was a living creature crawling out of their giant burst boil? Can you pull it out? Can I pull it out? Hell no! I'm not pulling that out! But it was my wife, and I was reasonably upset and needed to kill that thing. So yes, I'll try to pull it out. Oh God, please don't let it touch me. I went and got tweezers. No way was I using my fingers. I got that little bugger dead to rights in the grip of the tweezers. But that's when I discovered it wasn't trying to wriggle free. It was trying to wriggle back in. It was strong, too. What kind of nightmare did that thing come from that it could fight back? And then my wife started screaming. Agonizing wails like I had a grip on her guts and was pulling them out. I almost let go, but I was too determined to not let that thing loose. Our son, bless his heart, came racing into the room to save his mommy from whatever was hurting her. "Get out! Get out!" I yelled. "What's wrong with Mommy?" he asked. "She'll be fine in just a second. Just get out and don't look." And then I pinched the tweezers so hard that they snipped the end off of that thing. And with what almost seemed like glee, it slithered back into my wife's back and was gone, leaving just a wriggling little bit hanging from the tweezers. I rushed to the bathroom, in part because I felt ready to puke, and in part because I wanted to be rid of the thing. I wasn't thinking clearly. I should have hung on to it. Instead, I flushed it down the toilet and spent several minutes gripping my knees, waiting for my last meal to pay me a visit. She was gone. Not physically, but my wife wasn't there anymore. When I went back to check on her, she was just humming to herself and putting a bandage over the spot on her back. There was a nasty-looking stain on the sheets where she'd been sitting. She looked up at me and asked me if I was all right. "Me?" I cried. "You have a centipede crawling around inside of you." "No, I don't," she replied. "I saw it," I said. "We need to go to the hospital." I grabbed her wrist, and suddenly she wrenched free and grabbed mine instead. Good Lord, her grip was strong. She twisted my arm and shoved me away. "I'm fine," she said. She told me the next day that she'd been to see a doctor, and I believed her. She said the doctor couldn't find anything wrong and had congratulated her on doing such a fine job of popping it. Dear God, I just accepted what she told me as the truth. Then, 3 days later, she got him, my son. I didn't know. I hadn't realized yet that she wasn't her anymore. If I had known, don't you think I'd have taken him out of there the very first night? I would have driven to the far corner of the globe to keep him safe. I came home and he was already asleep in bed. "What's wrong with Tim?" I asked it, the thing that pretended to be my wife. "Oh, he's not feeling well, the poor dear." The poor dear. I went in and checked on him to see how he was doing. He was asleep, so I didn't wake him. It wasn't until the day after, while keeping tabs on him in the bath, that I noticed the red welt forming between his shoulder blades. "What's that?" I asked him. "Did you get hurt?" "That's my lucky mark," he said. Lucky mark? Mommy says it'll bring me luck." God, no, it still hadn't dawned on me. I can tell you now, but when I was living it, I wasn't putting two and two together. All I knew was my son had a mark on his back that was starting to look red and swollen, and since the incident with my wife 4 nights ago was over, and a doctor had supposedly given her a clean bill of health, I didn't think that the two were related. By the 5th night, it was exactly the same. An angry red blister, swollen with milky pus that seemed to be stirring underneath the skin. "This is some sort of infection," I told the thing that was pretending to be my wife. "Don't be silly. It's just a blister," she insisted. "It'll go away." "No, it won't. This is exactly like what you had. Maybe the thing that I saw coming out of your back got into him. We need to take him to the hospital immediately. Don't trouble yourself. If it looks this bad in the morning, I'll take him tomorrow, it promised. I'm taking him now, I yelled. No, you won't, she said, and her face went completely blank, just all expression lost. She opened her mouth, and her jaw hung down like it was loose in its socket. And even though she wasn't moving her jaw or her lips, I could still hear her talking. If you try to take him, I will split you from groin to gullet. I have never seen anything so awful as my wife's face all blank and her mouth hanging open while some thick second voice lurched out of her and threatened to disembowel me. Was I scared? You're damn right I was scared. And to make her point, the thing grabbed a handful of my gut and squeezed so hard I thought she was going to actually tear me apart right there. I was yelling in pain, and she just looked at me without any sort of expression and clenched my fist in her fist so hard I ended up with a black and yellow bruise for days afterwards. Who the hell cares about bruises, though? I was scared, and I knew it wasn't my wife anymore. I wanted to get my son out of there, but she never slept anymore. I suspect she had been faking sleeping all along. Me? I hadn't slept in our bed since the first night. I'd changed the sheets, but the stain from the stuff running down her back had left a mark on the mattress too, and I knew it was there and had no idea whether it was contagious or not. 2 days later, the boil on my son's back had dwindled to a red, sore spot again, but he was just like his mother now, always smiling and acting like everything was okay, never sleeping either. He'd let me put it to bed, but when I'd go to check on it later, I'd catch it with its eyes open before it shut them to try and convince me it was asleep. I can't keep pretending that they're my family. And then, of course, with me being outnumbered, they decided it was no longer necessary to keep up appearances when we were alone. They'd sit down on the couch in front of the television and just let the body shut off. Jaws hanging open, eyes rolled back in their sockets, holding hands like a loving mother and son. But I suspect something far more insidious. Maybe some sort of silent communication. If I got up, or if the phone rang, or someone came to the door, they'd immediately snap back to their game of pretending to be human. I've told others, but after the first several looks of sympathy for a man losing his mind, I gave up. It sounds cliché, but give me a break. You don't know how true it is until something this bizarre and frightening happens to you and nobody believes you. The police came and almost dragged me away, but the wife and son things convinced them not to. I'm the money earner, after all. They probably wouldn't know what to do to make a living. I can't sleep. They're waiting for me to fall asleep. They're in no rush. They can wait me out. It's been weeks now, and they just sit there and watch television and smile. And every now and then, they both turn to look at me at the same time to see if I've dozed off. Joke's on them, though, because I've been taking naps in the car after work before I drive home. The real problem is running out of food. I kept a freezer in the basement, stocked with a good month's worth of stuff, and they ate through it all, like a pair of ravenous hyenas. Neither of them leaves, so nobody goes grocery shopping. I make sure to just eat at work, hoping to starve them out into the open, but then they go and do what they've just done. Now that the dog's gone, there's only one thing left for them to eat. Won't that be a hell of a dilemma for them? Roommates. The second Daryl's keys were rattling in the lock, Katie was off the couch and racing to the front door. "Did you do it? Did you do it?" She was practically bouncing up and down with giddy anticipation and unwilling to give him a second to even breathe. "Did you kill her? Is it done?" Daryl couldn't help but to smile and shake his head. She was such a bad influence on him. He tried to remember the first time they had met, but for some reason was unable to. It just kind of seemed like she'd always been there. Tim and Jerry had been his roommates for close to 8 years, and somewhere along the way, she just kind of fell in with the twin brothers. Before Daryl knew what happened, she was living in the little 2-bedroom house as well. Remembering when the guys moved in was a little easier. He had liked them both immensely the first time they had met, and fell hard for their sob story of growing up as orphans with no real family other than each other. That wasn't the real reason he extended the invitation, however. The truth was, they were fun. Age-wise, they were technically adults, but their maturity level in no way reflected that. Neither of them ever bothered growing up, and there was really no telling what they might be getting into at any point in time. Plus, they really liked to play up the identical twin aspect, and enjoyed going with the same look as each other every day. Daryl could tell them apart. At the moment, Tim's hair was just a bit shorter than Jerry's, but most people didn't have a clue. Tim had told him once, quite some time ago, the story of how they'd met Katie in the area, but Daryl really didn't retain it. Tim had verbal diarrhea and a different story or 10 every day. It would have been impossible to try to keep them all in the memory banks. Tim's condition was aided considerably by the fact that he always had a bag of green herbs nearby. Jerry wasn't quite the stoner his brother was, but he did partake from time to time. Daryl hadn't complained when Katie started hanging around. There was something about her that he found truly compelling. It wasn't that he had the hots for her or anything like that. She was not at all his type, but she was sweet and funny and an absolute dynamo of highly contagious positive energy. He loved the way that she kept them all in line and yet on their toes at the same time. For all these reasons and others that he didn't fully understand, she could talk him into practically anything. She had an innate ability to persuade him into activities that most people would consider irrational, and a way of making sense out of it in the process. That's the way it was with Julie, his soon-to-be deceased ex-girlfriend, and Marcus, his recently deceased ex-best friend. As crushing a blow as discovering their secret liaison was, Daryl was originally going to just break off both relationships and count his blessings that he discovered the infidelity when he did, and not further down the road when she might have been his wife and he might have been his best man. It had been Katie who finally got him to see the reasoning behind ending their lives. They were, after all, bad people. Who knows who else they would have ended up hurting in the long run. It was the same thing with Yuri Milosh, the Ukrainian guy who used to live down the street that swindled Daryl out of nearly $3,000 in his Ponzi scheme. How many little old ladies would he have cleaned out before somebody finally stopped him? Then there was Pritchett Ricketts, the prick who kept pinching his clients by undercutting his offers on jobs. Daryl was one of the best small job carpenters in the area, but somehow that damned Ricketts was always on his tail. It was Katie that pointed out that the unscrupulous man must have been following Daryl. It also stood to her reasoning that there was no possible way of just cutting the leech out of his life, other than killing him, of course. Father Missioner was the only one Daryl tried putting up a significant argument against, and even now it weighed on his conscience. Father Andrew Missioner had been the pastor at the local Catholic church for nearly 40 years before he passed on. Daryl's grandmother, who left the little house to him when she died, attended services there twice a week, every week, until she died, and the priest had grown fondly attached to the longtime widow. When Daryl moved in 9 years ago, Father Missioner had made it a point to visit the home and check in on Doris's grandson, and Daryl quite liked the pleasant man. Not enough to attend his church, but he did like him. It was Tim and Jerry who initially didn't care for him. The first time they met, the father made a light-hearted joke about them being freeloaders who didn't pay rent, and despite the lack of malicious intent, the guys, who never took offense at anything, had their feelings hurt. That was really no big deal, but the priest continued to make weekly recruiting visits, and eventually Katie was the one to see the demons in him. Absolutely terrified the first time she saw the man and the creatures possessing him from within. She later explained that the gift was called discernment, and that she had always been able to see unclean spirits. Daryl fought her for some time on the issue, but her fear was real, and Katie never lied to him, or anyone for that matter. She was truthful to a brutal fault, and in the end, he believed. He believed in a world beyond the one he could see. He believed that Katie had gifts that he didn't, and above all, he believed her when she said that they would be plagued by demonic attacks if the poor man wasn't put out of his misery. It was, by her estimation, a mercy killing. Daryl had been hoping that moment of bestowed mercy would be the last time he would have to deal with such unpleasant things. But here he was again. "So?" she pressed. "Are you going to answer me or what?" Daryl chuckled again and pushed past her into the living room. "Are you gonna give me a chance to actually answer?" Katie feigned offense behind him and said, "Well, excuse me, by all means." Tim and Jerry were wrestling with each other on the couch like a couple of teenage boys, and didn't bring it to an end until Daryl plopped down on the couch next to them, diverting their attention. "Well?" Jerry asked what they were all thinking. "He hasn't said." Katie had positioned herself on the lazy boy across from them. "For some reason, he's trying to play it cool, which," she paused for effect, "is not cool." The brothers began to fall all over each other with raucous laughter, which brought Daryl's attention to the empty baggie and green herbs strung about the coffee table. They were high as kites. Sometimes living with those two was like being in a frat house, or having children maybe. He definitely didn't take them as seriously as he did his female roommate. "Well," Daryl finally spoke. "Not that you two yahoos will remember later, He was looking at the twins, and they fell into another round of side-splitting. But yeah, I did it. I cut her brake line. Katie's jaw dropped. You cut her brake line, she repeated. Daryl proudly nodded yes, but the pride only lasted a moment before Katie made her displeasure known. What the hell, Daryl? That's not what we talked about. You were supposed to poison her or stab her. Where the hell did you come up with cutting the brake line? She sighed, exasperated. How do you even know which one is the brake line? YouTube, Daryl replied sheepishly. I looked it up. The brothers couldn't stop laughing, Jerry actually falling to the floor and holding his sides. Katie didn't find it funny at all. You looked up a video on how to cut a brake line, and then you went and cut someone's brake line? Please tell me you at least used a guest account on a computer somewhere else. She seemed like she couldn't even believe she was having to ask, and it was the complete opposite of the reaction he had been expecting, especially when he could only mumble, I used my phone. Katie jumped across the couch and slapped him in the face, drawing blood with her nails. You fucking idiot, she yelled in his face. You screwed us all. Tim joined his brother, rolling on the floor as neither seemed to grasp why Katie was so upset. What are we supposed to do when you get arrested? Daryl was genuinely shocked. Why would he be arrested? I don't understand. That was all he could say, and Katie shook her head with sick pity, but was not given the opportunity to explain. The next few seconds passed in a blur. Broken glass filled the room from the windows, and chunks of wood flew in from the hall where the front door had been smashed from its hinges. Suddenly the room was full of men in black armor from head to tail, flashing lights and screaming. Violently thrown to the floor and handcuffed, Daryl couldn't see what condition his roommates were in. Much like him, they were probably overwhelmed by the sudden flurry of activity. Jerked to his feet and hustled down the hall, he knew that he would probably be in some degree of trouble, but he truly hoped that his friends wouldn't be charged with anything. He didn't see them being cuffed, and his name was the only one they stated as being under arrest and Mirandized, so hopefully they could be left out of whatever mess this turned into. As he was being pulled out the front door, Daryl called out over his shoulder, desperately hoping that they could hear him. Don't say anything, guys! Don't say a word! By that point, it was the best that he could do. An hour later, he was behind bars, barring the death penalty for the rest of his life. Toya Pearson couldn't help but to curse when the call came in at 1:45 in the morning. Raising two girls as a single mom, combined with a job that could call at any moment, as the current call proved, sleep was proving more and more elusive. The moment the ringtone woke her from deep sleep, she knew that she was done for the night. She didn't even have to answer it. It did, however, turn out to be a rather interesting call, though. The department had arrested a rather notorious serial killer. Not that it wasn't good news. One less sicko on the streets was good for everybody, but that wasn't the part that particularly interested her. It was his pets. Normally, the rare personality that fell into his range didn't keep pets. Not living ones anyway. But this man had 3 cats, which were currently in the kennel at headquarters. Were it not such a high-profile case, the animals would have most likely been turned over to animal control or the Humane Society, but given the uniqueness of the situation, they thought to call her. Toya's official title was that of a detective profiler, but everyone knew that her true passion was her feline rescue group. No one had a problem turning Katie, Tim, and Jerry over to her, and rather than put them through further trauma, she decided to keep them in the end. They won her over rather quickly with their infectious personalities, and her girls fell in love immediately as well. The youngest, Sarah, even claims that they speak to her. It's adorable. Man-Eater. Richard Mace had done well for himself. He and his wife had raised 3 beautiful boys, and they owned the biggest farm for miles around. No one had so many horses and sheep as he did. Each day he watched over his hundreds of chickens and his many herds of cattle. Each day there were more and more of them, and at first he was pleased. But before long, there were so many that he began to worry. He could not manage them all, and was forced to tend to them night and day. He often looked at them and thought, if only I was so hungry that I could eat them up, then life would be good again. That summer, a plague broke out among Richard's animals. Many of his cattle and sheep died. The chickens died too, and some of his horses. Richard was grateful for this. Surely I'm blessed, he thought. What a miracle this plague has been. But it did not seem that way for long. As the days passed, more sheep and herds of cattle died, then more chickens and more horses. Richard was alarmed. He had not the room or the time to bury them all. Soon he was exhausted and did nothing but lay in bed, watching summer turn to fall. One day, his wife came to his side. "Richard," she said calmly, "there's something I must tell you." "What is it?" he demanded. "Have the children died as well?" "Of course not," she replied. "You're going to be a father. I'm pregnant again." The farmer was overjoyed. He had always wanted another child. He was so thrilled that he got out of bed and chopped wood that very same day. But soon he noticed a change in his wife that worried him. She ate constantly and could not seem to stop. Night and day, she devoured all of their canned food and dry meal, and drank all their syrup and honey. She left nothing for the others. But stranger still, she did not gain weight, but instead seemed to be starving. "Please, wife, you must control yourself," Richard pleaded. "You'll starve us all if you do not stop eating." "I cannot stop," she cried. "The baby, he twists and turns inside me and hurts me when I stop eating." "What nonsense!" Richard cried. "You're just being selfish." "I am not!" his wife shrieked. "Not until I have eaten half a dozen chickens does he stop beating me, and he wants more each day and leaves nothing for me." Time went on, and as winter turned to spring, the plague moved on. Soon the animals were as numerous as ever, and just in time. The baby now demanded half a calf a day. Richard watched in horror as his wife butchered, fried, and devoured 3 of his cows each week. Even then, the baby scratched and kicked and twisted and turned, and the wife looked worse than ever. Just as it seemed that she might die, the wife gave birth to the baby boy. Soon thereafter, she recovered her strength. The baby was as hungry as ever, but Richard was no longer concerned because the plague had ended and food was plentiful. In just a few weeks, the chickens again numbered in the hundreds. The cattle were so many, no one could see them all as they stretched across the pastures. There were now dozens of horses and more sheep than ever. This would have worried Richard again, had it not been for the baby. As an infant, the boy ate 3 large chickens a day, and once old enough to walk, their largest sheep for breakfast and lunch, and a horse for dinner. Richard was horrified at this, but at least he had time to rest. Surely I am blessed, he thought. What a miracle this boy has been. But it did not seem that way for long. As more days passed, the boy continued to grow, as did his appetite. At times he was so ravenous, he seemed more like an animal than a boy, and more than once bit his mother's hand as she fed him. Besides, the farmer and his wife found themselves cooking constantly for the boy, so that they could get nothing else done. But Richard had an idea. "Wife," he said one morning after breakfast, "why bother cooking the meat at all? The boy eats so quickly, he would not notice if it were raw." "Perhaps you're right," his wife replied. "I am tired of feeding him. Take him to the pasture this afternoon and see what he does." That same day at noon, Richard took the boy to where as many animals grazed and let him go. In moments, the boy took off running and threw a small sheep to the ground. Then he tore open its throat with his bare hands and devoured it alive. The farmer watched in horror as his son rose from the bloody carcass with a crazed look in his eyes. Things went on like that for many weeks. Richard would take his boy to the pastures, and the boy would consume all the animals he could catch. The boy devoured calves and colts as a hungry dog eats chickens. Richard was disgusted by this, but could not do without the boy, whose appetite allowed him to keep his livestock at a manageable number, so he let things go on this way for months. After a while, Richard did not bother to stay with the boy, but began to leave him out in the fields all day long, and each night, when the farmer retrieved him, he swore his boy had grown larger and more like an animal. He noticed, too, after a month or so, that the boy was not just eating the meat of the animals anymore, but their bones as well. So there was no way to tell how many the boy had eaten. But the boy was growing. Of that, there was no doubt. Several months passed. Winter came and the animals would no longer breed, and yet the boy continued to eat them, as many as ever. Soon, the big flocks of chickens were gone, and the extra herds of cattle. There were but a few sheep left and half a dozen horses. The boy had eaten all the others. Richard was scared. The boy was so large then that he could not live in the house, but slept in an empty barn. "Oh, what have we brought upon ourselves?" the farmer cried. "The boy is no blessing. He's a curse." What will he do after he has eaten everything that we have? It did not take long to find out. In another week, all of the animals were gone, eaten by the boy, bones and all. There were no more sheep or horses. There were no more cattle or chickens. The farmer's wealth was gone, and his family was starving. Everyone was terribly angry, so they all marched to the barn where the boy lived and found him sleeping. They kicked him angrily.
"Look what you've done!"
the wife screamed.
"You've eaten everything we own!"
The boy, now grown to the size of a moose, woke from his slumber and groaned. "Mother," the boy growled, "I am hungry. Fetch me a horse to eat."
"I will not!"
she screamed and kicked him again.
"We have no more horses. You have devoured them all."
"Fetch me a cow then," the boy said to his brothers. "I am hungry."
"We will not!"
the boy's brothers screamed.
"We have no more cows. You ate them up, every last one."
At this, the boy stood and hissed at them all. "Oh, I am starving," the boy moaned. "What is there to eat?" "There's nothing left here," Richard cried. "Go and find food elsewhere." The boy did as he was told. That same day, he began wandering the countryside, devouring every animal he could find. Within days, Richard received word from his neighbors that something terrible had happened.
"Someone has taken all of my livestock,"
his neighbor cried.
"and they have taken our only daughter."
Richard knew it was his boy that had done it, but was too ashamed to admit it. "Perhaps a wolf has eaten your cows," Richard said. "As for your daughter, I'm sure she's hiding under her bed or playing in the fields. Go and look."
"Perhaps you're right,"
his neighbor replied.
"I will check the fields and return with news."
The neighbor did not return in several hours, so Richard sent his oldest son to find him. But night came, and still his son had not returned. In the morning, Richard sent his second oldest son to find the others, and at noon, his third boy rode off as well. By dinner that night, not one of them had returned. Finally, the farmer's wife offered to go and look for her sons.
"I cannot sleep another wink,"
she said,
"until I know my boys are home."
Her husband protested, but could not change her mind, so she rode off as well and left him there alone. Many hours passed and darkness fell again. Richard's wife was not home yet, and there was still no sign of his sons or his neighbor. He was quite worried, but exhausted too, and after some time drifted off to sleep. He was awakened in the night by a sound at his bedside. He shot up in bed immediately and held his breath. It was very dark indeed, and he could not see at all, but he heard the floor creak beside him and was scared. There was something there. He felt its hot, stinking breath on his neck as it leaned in. Richard gripped his sheets tightly. His teeth chattered. Just then, a deep, growling voice came from beside him. "I am ever so hungry," it rasped. "What is there to eat?" Richard was so scared he could hardly speak. "Nothing," Richard said. "Go and find food elsewhere." For a moment it was quiet, and then the thing leaned in closer. "You lie," the thing moaned. Richard could smell the rotting flesh in its teeth and hear the floor creaking under its weight. Richard swallowed hard and reached for his pistol on the nightstand. The thing leaned in closer. Richard could feel its teeth against his throat. "Father," the thing whispered, "you smell delicious." Gateway of the Mind. In 1983, a team of deeply pious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. The scientists had theorized that a human without access to any senses or ways to perceive stimuli would be able to perceive the presence of God. They believed that the five senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human could actually establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man who claimed to have nothing left to live for was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all of his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve connection to the brain was surgically severed. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. With no possible way to communicate with or even sense the outside world, he was alone with his thoughts. Scientists monitored him as he spoke aloud about his state of mind in jumbled, slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. After 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it was an onset of psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to the man's concerns. 2 days later, the man cried that he could hear his dead wife speaking with him, and even more, he could communicate back. The scientists were intrigued, but were not convinced until the subject started naming dead relatives of the scientists. He repeated personal information to the scientists that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. At this point, a sizable portion of scientists left the study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying that the voices were overwhelming. In every waking moment, his consciousness was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against the wall, trying to elicit a pain response. He begged the scientists for sedatives so that he could escape the voices by sleeping. This tactic worked for 3 days until he started having night terrors. The subject repeatedly said that he could see and hear the deceased in his dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-functional eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. The hysterical subject now said the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point, he yelled, "No heaven! No forgiveness! for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was close to establishing contact with God. After another day, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he started to bite off chunks of flesh from his arm. The scientists rushed into the test chamber and restrained him to a table so he could not kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For 2 weeks, the subject had to be manually rehydrated due to the constant crying. Eventually, he turned his head and, despite his blindness, made what appeared to be focused eye contact with a scientist for the first time in the study. He whispered, "I have spoken with God, and He has abandoned us." And his vital signs stopped. There was no apparent cause of death. Well, there you have it, everyone. The first installment of Night of the CreepyPastas. We hope that you've enjoyed these stories. Please go and check out the authors of these stories. You'll find credit information and links to some of their websites and other works in the video description. Take care of yourselves out there. Sweet dreams.